Hi, it's Janet Fitch, and this is my first Writing Wednesday since all of my book tour and travels and the holidays and all. I've just taken a large break, and but starting up again. And one of the topics that we've talked a lot about on Writing Wednesdays is using literature as textbook, using the great writers and tearing them apart and writing in the margins and figuring out how they do what they do. Because as you know, we're always becoming, we're always learning, we're always trying to get inspiration and fresh insight, and you don't get that from work that you just swallow it like a bag of Doritos and you're on with it. But the great books have a lot to teach us about writing. And I remember when I was a young writer hearing that, you read the great books and, you learn to write by reading. But because I was a history major, I didn't quite understand how that process worked. So what I'll be doing probably a good deal in this year's Writing Wednesdays is looking at great books and showing you how you take a book apart and not only see what they're doing, but set yourself exercises based on what they're doing that you can learn by trying it out. Hi, Ruthie. Nice to see you. And I just read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This is a very old book. I've had it for years and have not ever been able to really get into it. I'll admit it. I first tried to read it, even before I began writing. I tended to like her book, The Waves, a lot. The description was amazing, but this book really challenged me. And I had picked it up a few times in the years that followed, the decades that followed. Virginia Woolf was always a challenge for me. I don't necessarily like very small, intimate books. I tend to like more event, and larger scale event, which is not what she does. But it continues to call to me. And over the vacation, I watched a TV series on, I think it was a PBS series, about the Bloomsbury Group, of which I knew very little. Always got the personages all confused. And then when I went to England, I saw the house that Virginia Woolf and her sister Vanessa Bell lived in was it Gordon Square? So the show is called In the Squares because they lived in these various squares around Bloomsbury, and the love affairs, and who was these polyamorous relationships that they had, and kind of how shocking it was for two unsupervised girls of 19, Vanessa and Virginia, to live together without an older person involved, live the way they liked. The show was fabulous, but as usual, biopics or any kind of show about artists historically lead you to their work. When I went to college, one did not read secondary sources. If you were going to read, say, Montaigne, the philosopher, you did not read about Montaigne. You read Montaigne and you engaged directly with the text. there are times that these days I actually will do both, because I'm not in school anymore, uh, and don't have the benefit of sitting around a table for hours with other people, wrestling with the work. However, watching this biopic about Virginia Woolf and her sister and that whole group, which was wonderful, led me back to the work. And I looked at my shelf and I saw the Virginia Woolfs on my shelf, and I saw To the Lighthouse, and I just knew that this was a break for her. Her first, her first book was rather experimental, from what I gathered from the show, The Voyage Out. And she got hammered for it. People just could not get their head around what the hell was Virginia Woolf doing. Her next book was an attempt to be, and she was slammed by somebody that she respected, Forster, I think. So she tried to write a book more like something Forster would do, called Night and Day, which didn't do well either. And then she begins her experimental novels, Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway, and To the Lighthouse. And To the Lighthouse, I'm not hot on sort of the drawing room novel. It's not my thing. And so when I see people in a drawing room, I'm immediately going, oh God, is this going to be horrible or what? And it's a story of a family who is visiting the Isle of Skye. It's a large family. I guess in those days it wasn't remarkable, but there were 8 people, 8 children, father and mother. The father is a philosopher of some sort, or thinker, and the mother is sort of the locus of beauty. And then the father's hangers-on come up to, probably hit up on the daughters, and everybody has opinions but everybody else, and it's a big swirl. But the beginning of it is she's with her youngest, Mrs. Ramsay, the beautiful center of this whole family, is cutting out pictures with her youngest son. And the kid wants to are we going to go to the Lighthouse tomorrow? And the mother's like, yeah, let's, yeah, of course we're going to go. We're going to, and the father says, it won't be fair. We will, you won't be going. It's there's a phrase that he uses. It's just, the mother, it opens with the mother saying, yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow. And then the father comes in and says, but it won't be fine. So he just smashes the kid's hopes. Had there been an axe handy or a poker, any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him there and then, James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breast by his mere presence, standing as now, lean as a knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically, not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who is 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought, but also in some secret conceit at his own accuracy of judgment. What he said was true. He was always true. He was incapable of truth, never tampered with a fact, never uttered a disagreeable word to suit the pleasure or convenience of any mortal being, least of all his own children, who sprung from his loins, should be aware from childhood that life is difficult, etc., etc. Here Mr. Ramsay would straighten his back and narrow his little blue eyes upon the horizon. But it may be fine. Expect it will be fine. So this is at first I go, are we going to the Lighthouse? No, we won't go to the Lighthouse. Oh, the Lighthouse. And it made me think of On Golden Pond, the loons. I'm like, can I deal with this? I don't think so. But onward I go, hoping that something will happen. And I put it down after a few more pages of, going to the Lighthouse. It was just like, but I tried again and found that now I was actually seeing what she was doing. In the Lighthouse, she's not trying to write an external story the way, say, Tolstoy would write a story. That she's got a very different project going on, and this is not a this is an experimental novel that we are reading as the experiment is going on. And what she's all about are these moments that define a life. You know, you can really see that what she believes is that shimmering quality of moments, and then times when something, a small, tiny moment, kind of expands like, you know, a star exploding or something. It expands to mark, you know, a turning point in life. The thoughts of the characters are filled with these shimmering moments, images, phrases, and the emotional changes that they take within a 5-minute period. I mean, I can only imagine how rigorous Virginia Woolf had to be to follow those tiny changes, you know, as we think about the jet trail in the sky, and then what we're cooking, and then what somebody said to us, and then the possibility that, you know, we offended this person, and then watching, you know, then noting the hair on a cactus and the shimmering quality of this. She was not a stable person, and she was taking tremendous psychological risks at exploring the nature of consciousness the way she did. That's an emotional risk that I don't see in Joyce, I don't see in the other modernists, to really try to apprehend that vibrating, ephemeral, changeable moment of the mind, for the mind to observe itself that sensitively. I mean, if you're unstable, that is a really scary thing to be undertaking. Most people would say, why don't you, you know, write something linear and external and event filled and blah, 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 you know. But no, she wanted to explore consciousness. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable what she does. I've completely, the minute I finished this book, I wanted to start it again. And there's a group of people, the way it's set up, there's a group of people. So there's the 8 Ramsay children, some of whom play more of a part than the others. There are guests, some of whom are staying with them, some of whom are staying in lodgings in town. There's a lady artist. So you can feel that there's a vibration between Mrs. Ramsay, who's the locus of beauty, who keeps this whole circus running, who keeps her husband propped up, keeps the children going, makes everything beautiful because she's there. She's that live element in the center, said to be based on, see, I did secondary work, said to be based on Virginia Woolf's mother, who died when she was fairly young, a preteen, and then everything broke loose after she died. So Mrs. Ramsay is a precious object, but she is an old-fashioned woman who, this is her life, is to prop up her husband and keep everything, all the plates spinning, and anybody who's done that knows what that's like. And an artist. Okay, I remember her second name, but not the first name. Lily Briscoe, a name like that. And this character is the Virginia stand-in, who, I believe it's Lily, yeah, who is the artist just trying to say something true on this canvas. And she's unmarried. She's probably not going to get married, although Mrs. Ramsay has ideas about her. What's interesting in this book is that there's not a tension between the two, but the way they apprehend one another is kind of a little engine in there. And every single person has ideas about every other single person in this. So it is a hall of mirrors in a certain way. Like if we've talked a lot about point of view in these Writing Wednesdays. And the point of view of this is not omniscient, but the point of view moves from character to character in a way that I call it, it's not omniscient because we never have the viewer pull out and come in again. It more the locus of interest, like one character's thinking shimmer, 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 and then suddenly you have the other person shimmer, 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 and then they're thinking about each other as they go along. And they're thinking about other people that we've seen, and some of the themes and repetitions and reverberations in the book will appear in these small scenes. So I wanted to talk about one interaction I want to talk about one that to show you what that's like. Hi, Christy. And there is one of the hangers-on of the fathers is this guy named Charles Tansley, and the Ramsay kids don't like him, so they like split right after dinner because they don't want to hang around with him. And Mrs. Ramsay always refers to him as the atheist. So to her, there's a certain quality about him that to her that to say he's an atheist means there's something missing about him. I mean, it's a different context than we would, perhaps, knowing many atheists, not have, but you get the context as it goes along. And the first thing we see him is that he seconds the father in squashing that kid's hope of going to the lighthouse. The atheist. And we don't care about the atheist, but the little atheist, Rose mocked him, all the kids, Prue mocked him, Andrew, Jasper, Roger mocked him, even old Badger without a tooth in his head had bit him for being, as Nancy put it, the 110th young man to chase them all the way up to the Hebrides when it was ever so nice, much nicer to be alone. So another one of the father's hangers-on. Nonsense, said Mrs. Ramsay, with great severity. Apart from her habit of exaggeration, which they had from her, the children, and from the implication, which was true, that she asked too many people to stay, and had to lodge some in town, she could not bear incivility to her guests, to young men in particular, who were poor as church mice, exceptionally able, her husband said, his great admirers, and came there for a holiday. And she always defended men, which is something that Virginia, as a newer kind of woman, had to look at her mother's generation and go, what was it about them? That she had the whole of the other sex under her protection. So this old-fashioned woman, yet she felt like she was protecting the men, which brings up a whole set of gender questions that this book, right at the beginning, in 25, she was asking and teasing apart. And we rarely talk about this kind of protective instinct that traditional women have towards men that kind of has upset the apple cart now that women have decided they don't have the responsibility to do that anymore. So she's thinking about this poor guy, Tansley, that she could not explain. Reasons she could not explain for their chivalry and valor, for the fact that they negotiated treaties, ruled India, blah, blah, blah. And finally, for an attitude towards herself, which no woman could fail to feel or find agreeable, or something trustful, childlike, reverential, which an old woman could take from a young man without loss of dignity. And woe betide the girl, pray heaven it was none of her daughters, who did not feel the worth of it, and all that it implied to the marrow of her bones. And her daughters, Virginia Woolf's mother, her daughters stepped away from this. They did not want to make that the primary goal in their lives, of supporting men and admiring them and stroking them. And there's a huge bunch of this book that's about the father's need for female sympathy, which means that stroking and caressing and propping up and feeling sorry for them and so forth. It is major. Something we don't think about much. So she feels sorry for this Tansley guy and invites him to go for a walk with her. He's sort of crushing on. Here's Charles Tansley from Mrs. Ramsay's point of view. There'll be no landing. Hey, hi, Brett. There'll be no landing at the Lighthouse tomorrow, said Charles Tansley. So he's, just following the father, clapping his hands together as he stood at the window with her husband. So this is Mrs. Ramsay's point of view. We move the point of view around a lot in this book, so I'll always tell you which one. Surely he had said enough. She wished they would both leave her and James alone and go on talking. She looked at him. He was such a miserable specimen, the children said, all humps and hollows. He couldn't play cricket. He poked. He shuffled. He was a sarcastic brute, Andrew said. Another one of the kids. They knew what he liked best, to be forever walking up and down with Mr. Ramsay and saying who had won this and who had won that, who was a first-rate man at Latin verses, who was brilliant but I think fundamentally unsound, who was undoubtedly the ablest fellow at Balliol. So he's like a kiss-ass. He's trying to get Ramsay to say that he's the best, right? But was bound to be heard of later when his prolegomena, which Mr. Tansley had the first pages in proof with him, if Mr. Ramsay would like to see them. Some branch of mathematics or philosophy saw the light of day. That was what they talked about from the mother's point of view. She could not help laughing herself sometimes. She said the other day something about waves mountains high. Yes, said Charles Tansley, it was a little rough. Aren't you drenched to the skin? She had said. Damp, not wet through, said Mr. Tansley, pinching his sleeve, feeling his socks. So she gets these nice little details that bring the person alive. But it was his manners. It was him, his point of view. When they talked about anything interesting, people, music, history, anything, even said it was a fine evening, so why not sit out of doors? Then what they complained of about Charles Tansley was that until he had turned the whole thing round and made it somehow reflect himself, and that is his need, and that's the father's need too. And we're starting to look at how men and women are together. Until he had made it somehow reflect himself and disparage them, he was not satisfied. So what a jerk, huh? And he would go to picture galleries, they said, and he would ask one, did one like his tie? God knows, said Rose, one did not. And so the children disappearing as stealthily as stags from the dinner table. Directly as the meal was over, the 8 sons and daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay sought their bedrooms, their fastnesses in a house where there was no other privacy to debate anything, everything. So they would go and trash Tansley and talk about the Swiss girl, the maid, who, all kinds, sobbing for her father dying of cancer, and everything else that they would talk about. So she thought about her family, and then she thought back about her girlhood. Mrs. Ramsay is in her 50s and thinks about her girlhood and how she had the blood of some very noble Italian house in her, so she's somehow not quite English. The English stolidity and stuff doesn't really apply to her. So her own beliefs about herself come in. And then she decides that she's going to go to do some charity work, about which she's had a lot of thoughts, like, why do I really do this? What are really my motivations? And these poor people, but, so she's a very self-questioning person. But she thinks about all the people who she could go for this walk with, and she thinks about all of them, but they had all gone. So she turned with a sigh and said, "Would it bore you to come to town with me, Mr. Tansley?" Oh, God. So she's ambivalent, she wants to keep the party, to keep the household lively and going, and sees somebody who's free, and she's going to take him with. She had a dull errand in town. She had a letter or two to write. She would be 10 minutes, perhaps. She would put on her hat. And with her basket and her parasol, there she was again, 10 minutes later, giving out a sense of being ready, of being equipped for a jaunt, which, however, she must interrupt for a moment, and as they passed the tennis lawn, to ask Mr. Carmichael, who is like an opium addict, who was basking with his yellow cat's eyes ajar, so that, like a cat's, they seemed to reflect the branches moving or the clouds passing, but to give no inkling of any thoughts or emotion whatsoever if he wanted anything. And then he is not interested at all. His hands clasp over themselves, over his capacious paunch. His eyes blinked as if he would have liked to reply kindly. He's a poet and one of the father's contemporaries. If he would like to reply kindly to these blandishments, she was seductive, but a little nervous. So now we've got his point of view, but could not, sunk as he was in a gray-green somnolence which embraced them all without need of words, in a vast and benevolent lethargy of well-wishing, all the house, all the world, all the people in it, for he had slipped into his glass at lunch a few drops of something, which is his drug of choice, which accounted, the children thought, for the vivid streak of canary yellow in mustache and beard that were otherwise milk white. It was the opium. "No, nothing," he murmured. "He should have been a great philosopher," said Mrs. Ramsay, as they went down the road to the fishing village, "but he had made an unfortunate marriage." So there's a lot of these mystifying social codes in the book that 1925, and especially someone of Mrs. Ramsay's generation, which is, she's looking at her, Virginia Woolf is looking at her mother's generation and at their social codes. And boy, if, she's giving us a look at something that she sees because she doesn't buy into it, but it's anthropological for sure. He'd made an unfortunate marriage. Now, what the hell is an unfortunate marriage? Is she a bitch? Well, evidently not. Holding her black parasol, so she thinks about this guy who's not walking with them as she opens her parasol and thinks about his past. Holding her black parasol very erect and moving with an indescribable air of expectation. I love that POV switch. That's what I want you to look for as I'm going on here. If she was going to meet someone round the corner, she told the story. So she's telling the story to herself of this guy, the poet, with the opium in his beard. If she was going to meet someone round the corner, she told the story. An affair at Oxford with some girl. An early marriage. Poverty. Going to India. So these are all kind of outlandish things in her perception. So we're getting a sense of that society just by what is being sort of disapproved of here, right? Going to India, translating a little poetry very beautifully, I believe, being willing to teach the boys Persian or Hindustani, but what was really the use of that? So she's sort of a conventional woman. And then lying, as they saw him, on the lawn. It flattered him. Snubbed as he had been, it soothed him that Mrs. Ramsay should tell him this. Charles Tansley revived. So that's a POV shift. We're going from her, a little bit of Carmichael, suddenly we're in Tansley. It flattered him, snubbed as he had been. It soothed him that Mrs. Ramsay should tell him this. So there's no pulling out to the narrator. There's just a passing of the torch, right? Miss Charles Tansley revived, insinuating, too, as she did, the greatness of man's intellect, even in its decay, the subjection of all wives. Not that she blamed the girl, and so we're back in her. Not that she blamed the girl, and the marriage had been happy enough, she believed. So why unfortunate? To their husbands' labors, which is what she does, right? She made him feel, so we're him again, she made him feel better pleased with himself than he had done yet, and he would have liked it had they taken a cab, for example, to have paid for it. He's sort of crushing on her, even though she's older. She's a great beauty. He would have liked, had they taken a cab, for example, to have paid for it. As for her little bag, might he not carry that? No, she said. She always carried that herself. So a little bit of live scene. Then, as for, she did too. Yes, he felt that in her. So there's a POV. He felt many things, something in particular that excited him and disturbed him for reasons which he could not give. We know, but he doesn't quite know what his feelings for her are. He would like her to see him, gowned and hooded, walking in a procession, a fellowship, a professorship. He felt capable of anything and saw himself, but what was she looking at? So this shows us, as a man in this era, Virginia Woolf is showing us that the children are right. He turns everything to himself. And the most glorious thing that he can imagine is not like, stealing off to Paris with her, but her watching him receive some sort of award, the audience. Like, this is the missing element. This is what women of her generation did for men. They were the audience, and the men are very vulnerable. They really need this. It's kind of an insoluble problem because the people in Virginia's generation, Virginia and her sister in that generation, discovered they don't really want to spend and the children, the girls in this book, the Ramsay girls, they don't really want to spend their lives being, somebody's audience and applauding and being sympathetic and all that. They want to have lives of their own. But Charles Tansley really would like that. And that's all he can think of, his attraction to her. He can't put it in physical terms. He wants just the audience, the approval, the sort of motherly admirer. A professorship, a fellowship. He felt capable of anything and saw himself, but what was she looking at? Suddenly he doesn't have her attention. It's like, wait a second, Mommy, weren't you paying attention to me? So what was she looking at? A man pasting a bill. The vast flapping sheet flattened itself out, and each shove of the brush revealed fresh legs, hoops, horses, glistening reds and blues, beautifully smooth. Okay, whose impression are we in now? Until half the wall was covered with the advertisement of a circus, 100 horsemen, 20 for performing seals, lions, tigers, ... Craning forward, for she was short-sighted, she read it out. We'll visit the town, she read. So I think that we have the omniscient narrator in there. We have Virginia. Then craning forward, she read it, for she was short-sighted, she read it out. We'll visit this town, she read. It was terribly dangerous work for a one-armed man, she exclaimed. So now we're in her. She knows this guy and knows, he's a one-armed man. Dangerous to stand on top of a ladder like that. His left arm had been cut off in a reaping machine 2 years ago. He's somebody from the town that she knows. Let's all go, she cried, moving on as if those riders and horses had filled her with childlike exultation and made her forget her pity for Charles Tansley. Let's go, he said, repeating her words, clicking them out, however, with a self-consciousness that made her wince. So we have Charles, but making her wince, that's her internals, so her point of view. No, that made her wince. Let us go to the circus. That's Charles talking, but we're in her. No, he could not say it right. He could not feel it right. She's been trying to like this guy, but what he just said about the circus pisses her off. He could not say it right. He could not feel it right. But why not, she wondered. What was wrong with him then? She liked him warmly at that moment. Now, isn't that interesting? See how the emotions shimmer? She likes him, she doesn't like him. She's getting along with him, and then suddenly he says something that he doesn't like. I mean, moment by moment, we're in the shifting, shimmering moment to the lighthouse. Had they not been taken, she asked, to circuses when they were children? Never, he answered, as if she had asked the very thing he wanted, had been longing all these days to say, how they did not go to circuses. It was a large family, 9 brothers and sisters, and his father was a working man. My father is a chemist, Mrs. Ramsay. He keeps a shop. He himself had paid his own way since he was 13, and we start getting his part of the puzzle of his trouble with the Ramsays is that he didn't grow up in this fairly affluent, cultured family. Often he went without a greatcoat in winter. He could never return hospitality, which means when somebody buys around, then you buy around. If you can't do it, you can't even go out. You can't have a social life. Those were his parched, stiff words at college. He did have to make things last twice as long as other people, talking about his deprivation. He worked hard 7 hours a day. And then he's starting to talk about his readership, lectureship, his studies, blah, blah, blah. And Mrs. Ramsay did not quite catch the meaning, only the words here and there: dissertation, fellowship, readership, lectureship. She could not follow the ugly academic jargon that rattled itself off so glibly, but said to herself that she saw now why going to the circus had knocked him off his perch. Poor little man. So here comes the pity again. That is her role, is to pity and feel sympathy for men. And here she goes back with all about his father and mother and brothers and sisters, and she would see to it they didn't laugh at him anymore. She would tell Prue, the oldest girl, about it. What he would have liked, she supposed, would have been to say how he had not gone to the circus but to Ibsen with the Ramsays. So she's feeling pity for him and realizing, what he'd like to be able to say was that he was part of an intellectual life that he had posited on their family. What he would have, oh, he was an awful prig. Oh, yes, an insufferable bore. So back she goes, to be sick of him. So her honest reactions are that she's sick of him. And then every once in a while, something comes up and she feels sorry for him. And what I wanted to convey about Under the Volcano, To the Lighthouse, is that it is full of the back and forth in just a very short time of how we feel about each other, the way she passes the point of view around, the role, the sexual role, gender roles that are being questioned in this. It is a fabulous book. And how do you make exercises for yourself based on To the Lighthouse? You could imagine two people walking together, like Charles and Mrs. Ramsay, and pass the point of view back and forth, but especially have that resonant attitude that changes and changes, and how one person is understood by another person, and then show the example of that. I think that just to take the form of that little scene with Charles and Mrs. Ramsay, you come back to reality. You have the guy putting up a poster or doing something, and one of the characters, your Mrs. Ramsay character, your more favored character, maybe having some knowledge of that person, and see if you can take that and set it in terms of your own period that you like to work in, your own kind of characters, and see how it goes. So I would recommend To the Lighthouse, and give Virginia Woolf a real try. This is not going to be reading, your page-turning bestseller. It's going to require a little application of mental effort, but well worth it. And then try the exercise, it's like I was describing going to see magicians at the Magic Castle here in LA. And sometimes you'll go into the close-up room where they're doing like really, really interesting magic. Just incredible. Somebody like me, I don't want to know how it's done. I just want to go, oh my God. But if somebody's really good, you'll see all the magicians standing in the back, and they're watching. And what's interesting with them is that it's not that they don't know how it's done. It's that they do know how it's done. And they just want to see that person do it because they do it so well. We want to be magicians looking at other magicians and understanding how they achieve what they achieve, and what we could use, or what we can try, what we might want to use from what they can do. So we're not reading so much as we are studying and tearing it apart. I'll show you what my pages look like of this book. I'm going to switch this. Do you see how, this way, yeah. You see how the pages are covered with notes. I would never let this get out of my hands. And any note that you make, you might be able to make an exercise for yourself and try it. Try it yourself. See how they put together what they're doing. So Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you try Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Thanks. Bye.